Everyone to today's webinar. I'm Joe Ali. I'm a faculty member at the Berman Institute at Johns Hopkins, joined by colleagues Professor Adiba Kamarulzaman, Nisha Gopalan, and Elise Wilson, and Tivia, and our guest speaker today, Professor Calvin Ho, which we were delighted to have join us. I'm going to share my slides for one moment just to do a quick introduction and then hand over maybe to you, Adiba, to introduce our speaker today, if that's all right. And let me do that here. Great. So today we'll be sharing another presentation within our webinar series, which is a jointly hosted webinar sponsored by the Moraes program, the Master of Research Ethics Studies program, which is a collaboration of University of Malaya and Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics with support from the Fogarty International Center of the US NIH. We've had the pleasure over the past a couple of years now of hosting a number of different speakers in this series, and all of these speaker talks have been recorded and are posted to our program website. We'll post a link to that shortly in the chat if you're interested in listening to recordings. The collaborative program is supporting a Master of Health Research Ethics training program, which is, as you can see on the next slide here, a one-year full-time master's degree program based at the University of Malaya. We have an intake of a cohort of students every year, approximately 10 students, which is supported by scholarships, and every September take in a new cohort. The goal of the program is to help produce graduates equipped with knowledge and skills necessary to engage in health research ethics practice and scholarship and teaching. And it's been a real pleasure to work with colleagues at the University of Malaya to help to develop this program, and I think successfully graduate now a couple of cohorts of students. So if you're interested, welcome to reach out to the program and learn more. As with most webinars, we're following a typical format where we'll have a presentation from today's speaker, followed by an opportunity for discussion and question and answer. We'll be moderating and we'll take questions in turn as they appear. Please feel free to use the Q&A link at the bottom of the webinar, and we'll take questions as they appear in turn. Great. With that brief intro, let me hand over to my colleague, Professor Kamarulzaman, for a brief introduction of our speaker today and to kick us off. So over to you, Adiba. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and good morning from Kuala Lumpur to everyone, and good evening if you're joining in from the States. I'm very, very pleased to introduce our eminent speaker, Dr. Calvin Ho. Joe has said that it will be a brief introduction. I'm looking at CV now, I'm thinking, which one will I pick? Because Calvin, you have a very impressive CV, holds a doctorate in juridical science from Cornell University, and trained in law at the NUS in Singapore, as well as Cambridge. In addition, he read sociology and economics at the LSE and at the School of Oriental and African Studies. He's qualified as an advocate and solicitor at Supreme Court of Singapore, as well as solicitor of senior courts of England and Wales. Calvin now is at the Hong Kong University as an assistant professor at the Center for Biomedical Ethics, at the Hong Kong University, and he's also an assistant professor at the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the Yong Loo School of Medicine, in addition to holding a whole host of other important committee memberships. So we're very, very honored to have you here this morning, Calvin, and look forward to listening to you on the topic of bridging the research therapy divide in the regulatory governance of AI as medical devices. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Adiba, for this very kind invitation and introduction as well. I'm also grateful to Professor Gopalan, having reached out to me earlier on, and of course our very dear colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Professor Joe Ali, as well as Professor Jeremy Sugarman. So thank you so much for the invitation, and congratulations on the excellent program from what I'm hearing. It's been highly successful and certainly very helpful in building up regional capacity in research ethics. So let me just share my slides and we shall be on our way. Let's see if I'm able to do so. Right. Is it coming through, just to check?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thanks so much, Joe.
Thanks, Scott.
I do have a number of slides, so I'll try to be quick with some of them. My apologies for running a bit over the designated time of about 25 minutes, but there should be enough time for Q&A towards the end. If you do have any comments at all, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. I think you should be able to use those, and I'll catch up as the presentation goes along. So a little bit of what I'll talk about today. So the context itself is essentially about the Greater Bay Area. So that as some of you may be aware, this particular area is constituted by 3 different jurisdictions. Of course, you have the Guangdong province, that's essentially mainland jurisdictions, and then you see a convergence of the jurisdictions of Hong Kong and Macau. We're also talking about 3 rather different health systems. So it's quite interesting. I won't be able to go into the intricacies, but if you should have any comments or questions at all, again, please feel free to drop them in the chat box, and I'll try to respond to them. If not, feel free to get in touch afterwards via email or through social media. So what's to talk about? It's essentially concerned with the development and use of AI as medical device. So there will be a research ethics component, but my argument here is that if we follow some of the important developments in AI, they challenge how we would conventionally think about the research ethics and therapy divide. So a bit more about that. I do have a position which I will advance. Hopefully you'd find that convincing. If not, I'd love to hear your thoughts as to why that is. In terms of when all of these developments are happening, well, as you know, we're in the big data era. So, well, some scholars have noted this as the 4th revolution. Now, I think this is important because it does distinguish research that's currently being done, whether it's in relation to AI or in some other fields like genomics, for instance, or in fact, many other scientific fields. But well, we won't have time to go into some of these other very interesting and engaging areas, but just focusing on AI development, of course, you see that there's been a number of very important developments. Now, healthcare is a bit late in the development for good reasons, I think. We'd see a lot more developments, AI-related developments in commerce, in finance. You'd see, of course, these as continuing to progress, especially with challenges relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. But as I've mentioned today, we will be focusing on the healthcare context, and I think there'll be quite a bit to think about already. So where are we going with all of these developments? Or at least for this part of the world, there is a very strong interest in developing an integrated learning healthcare system. Of course, I like to highlight the word integrated because here you'd see, of course, the integration of 3 different health systems for essentially historical reasons. But then, of course, you'd see the facilitation of convergence in this particular region. So, but in terms of the broad trajectory, that's generally the sort of goal that these developments are directed at. So we'll speak a bit more about what a learning healthcare system is. In fact, it's a concept that has been written quite a lot about by Joe's colleagues at Hopkins, and I want to build on a number of the points that they've mentioned. And how do we get there? Of course, there are many different factors, many different conditions, but I'd like to focus on what would be broadly referred to as regulatory governance, which means governance through different regulatory means of which, of course, the law is just one tool, broadly speaking. There are also related infrastructural considerations. I guess everyone in the audience and certainly those in the Johns Hopkins course, right, will be familiar with the research ethics processes. Of course, that's part of the infrastructure that we are speaking to. And my argument is that we need to think about how all of these various means, all of these various approaches will need to be adapted in a way that is, I would argue, collaborative, participatory, and responsive if we are to achieve our goal of building up an integrated learning healthcare system, drawing on essentially AI technology and data analytics. So, of course, the critical question would be who ought to be responsible for all of this, and how do we attribute various responsibilities? Now, I won't have time to go very much into this, but I've got hopefully some useful references at the end. You're welcome to look at those. But my general argument is that, as you've noted, participatory being an element, I would put forward this proposition that any sort of path moving forward will need to reflect a very strong partnership among regulators, developers, and profession. Because profession, first of all, of course, within a healthcare setting, I would mean the medical profession. So I'll share a bit more about some of the developments in this part of the world. So let's begin to look at the context. So as I've mentioned, we are talking about the Greater Bay Area, and as you see, I've got a map with some of the key cities in the region. It's, of course, as you know, in the southern part of China, and it's among the 4 largest Bay Areas in the world. The 3 others being New York City and San Francisco. Of course, those in the US will be familiar with these 2 areas. And then, of course, the Tokyo Bay Area. The total population is quite sizable, as you see that. It's home to a large number of Chinese technology companies. Of course, some of you will be already very familiar with the mobile phone company, Huawei, and of course, that's ZTE Corporation, Tencent. Some of you may also be familiar with WeChat, so that's the holding company, and SenseTime that has been recently listed on the Hong Kong Exchange. So as I've mentioned, there are 3 constituent jurisdictions in the Bay Area. So you've got in the Guangdong province, a particular approach to regulating medical devices. So that would traditionally fall within the purview of the National Medical Products Administration. Now, of course, this particular entity would be, in terms of its powers, backed by legislation. But of course, that's not the case in Hong Kong and Macau. So quite interestingly, just to speak about Hong Kong in the interest of time. So for Hong Kong, for instance, there is not yet legislation in place that speaks to the regulation of medical devices. That is going to change, or at least that's the political sentiments at this point. So in Hong Kong, there is, however, a division that's been set up as part of the Department of Health. It was established some time back, actually in 2004, but it's recently renamed as a division. So looking very carefully into international standards and how it would apply within a more local and then regional setting, and drawing in some of these key principles, and a number of important developments to follow will be, of course, I would expect, provisions on the regulation of AI or machine learning based medical devices. So currently what we have in place here in Hong Kong is a registration system. It's known as the Medical Device Administrative Control System, as you see on this slide. And there are a number of features, of course. As part of the registration mechanism, you have a voluntary listing of, as well as a list of medical devices, and you have an adverse incident reporting system as part of this overarching structure. But as I've mentioned, there will be more changes, but I wanted to highlight this because what you'd see on the one hand is that on mainland China, you'd see a relatively developed system for medical devices regulation. That system, again, in the interest of time, of course, this is a generalization, but it's quite similar to what you'd find in the US, which is, of course, the FDA system. And the FDA, as many of you in the US would know, has had some very important provisions on regulating AI or machine learning-based devices and a number of processes to help develop this technology. That would be the breakthrough device mechanism, the de novo mechanism. So depending on the risk feature of the device concerned. So a bit more about that later. So, but coming back to this region, I'd just like to invite everyone to think about, of course, what sort of health system and related infrastructure that we will need in order to move the technology ahead. You'd see that, of course, this speaks to data requirements, this speaks to the research infrastructure, and I highlight these two in particular because I think they are probably most pertinent to the present audience. So what sort of governance approaches and what values? I guess everyone familiar with research ethics will know the 4 principles or 3 or 4, depending on whether you are thinking about Belmont or the Georgetown mantra. So that would be, of course, respect for persons, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice, right? But then, of course, when you move into the AI domain, there would be arguably a number of other principles that we're not to be thinking about, as well as other sorts of processes that we will need to engage with. We also think we need to think quite hard about who the stakeholders are and what their interests could be. So as you see in a bit, when we think about medical devices, they tend not to be experimented within strictly contained or strictly defined conditions of a clinical trial. Of course, there are device trials, but they're very different, I would argue, from conventional pharmaceutical drug trials. So the sort of provisions that you see in the ICH GCP and other provisions that apply to standard clinical trials, even for advanced therapy products, would not work well, I would argue, for medical devices, and even less so for devices that are based on AI or machine learning. So a bit more about recent developments in the region. So you see in 2020, there has been a new medical device work plan that's put in place in the region. So it's meant to facilitate development because, as you see earlier on, I've mentioned, the National Medical Products Administration in Beijing is responsible overall for the regulation of medical devices, but it has, through the work plan, delegated authority to the Guangdong Provincial Administration. So it is now the responsibility of the provincial administration to work with the administrations in Hong Kong and Macau to facilitate the development of medical devices, as well as access to these devices in the region, of course, in a manner that is safe and with some assurance as to efficacy. So what's interesting is that medical institutions in 9 specified cities have this responsibility of working up the plan. And happy to say that, of course, HKU, University of Hong Kong, one of our hospitals in Shenzhen, that's just across the border from the Special Administrative Region of Hong Kong. So, so that's one of the institutions responsible for the gradual implementation of this particular work plan. I've indicated some of the processes in case you're interested, but as I've noted, this is very much still in the works, and we'll see quite a lot more developments in the coming years. So Going now to when, so a bit more about the big data era. I think all of you will probably be familiar that we now have the benefit of working with a lot of data. So as you see on this particular slide, an image taken from a paper in Nature Medicine, you'd see all the different sorts of information that could be used. Of course, one of the key challenges that they are not of equal quality, they are not equally available, and of course we are still confronted with a lot of interoperability concerns. So while there are these challenges that we are attempting to grapple with, the potential is there. So what AI technology does, of course, as many of you know, would be to enable us to draw on the benefit of these resources in moving our current health system towards what I've mentioned as the learning healthcare system, and more about that in a bit. So you see this rather sci-fi image. I'm essentially thinking ahead into the future about where we could go with AI technology. So artificial intelligence, as many of you would know, is a broad umbrella for many different kinds of AI-related techniques or capabilities. Machine learning, of course, is a subset of artificial intelligence. And then, of course, an even more sophisticated form of machine learning would be deep learning. So we're not quite there at deep learning yet. So a lot of the technologies that we see today, particularly within a healthcare setting, right, would be more conventional kind of artificial intelligence technology. So as you see on the slide, right, that's the outermost light blue kind of elliptical. So these will draw on, these I would say are rather sophisticated statistical tool to support decision making. And then, of course, if you move into the machine learning domain, then there would be the capability for the device concerned to learn in a sophisticated manner and pick up points that a human individual may miss. So some of you would already have seen quite a few reports on this. But we're not quite there on the deep learning front. The potential is certainly there, but in terms of implementation within health systems, I am currently not aware of it, which means that these are relatively autonomous devices capable of acting on their own without much guidance in terms of how they learn, what they learn, and the sort of data that is being fed into the device itself. Of course, if you contrast deep learning with machine learning, right, then for machine learning, essentially, it is about the use of curated data, and training will be in a very supervised kind of way. So if you're interested to know more about these technologies, the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges has produced a very helpful report with a quite a helpful primer, I think, on the technology, and also highlighting a number of challenges. So do feel free to have a look at that. It is on the reference list that will appear at the end of this presentation. So in terms of the technologies that we have now, so I like to mention the IDXDR. This is a remote diagnostic device for diabetic retinopathy. It's one of the first AI-based device to be approved by the US FDA. There is a similar technology that's being tested in this part of the world. But then, of course, what I've mentioned here is, of course, with reference to the JAMA paper, is that you'd see the AI technology, again, exhibiting machine learning capability, but in terms of its deep learning potential, that particular feature is currently locked, which means it's not in application. So IDXDR is still being tried out in a relatively controlled setting. And of course, we look forward to learning more about how it is performing once the data becomes available. But here, of course, we already see an application in place. This review by Eric Topol is, I think, very helpful because it just speaks to the point of the sorts of various high-performing medical devices that we have currently available. But then you'd see that in terms of the very sophisticated sort of device that's able to operate on its own, not quite that yet. So you'd see the intermediation of healthcare professionals in the use of such devices. So I think this particular paper, if you're interested, do have a look. It does give quite a good overview of the lay of the land. So when we think about how do we think about medical devices from a regulatory standpoint? A series of documents have been published by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. Of course, this particular forum is constituted by regulators from all of the key AI jurisdictions. So of course, that would include both the US and China. So essentially, these devices are regulated as, a broad term of software as medical device. So it's essentially a software, but the software itself is taken to be a medical device and regulated as such. Now, it's important to understand this because from a regulatory standpoint, there is continuity in thinking about its relationship with other medical devices. So in this particular diagram, that's also taken from one of the documents published by the IMDRF in short, right? Shows how there is this continuum of medical devices that are not AI or machine learning based, and then of course those that are. And in the category of those that are software as medical device, how they are further subcategorized by a number of considerations. So that you'd have essentially drawing on some of the general regulatory principles that are already in place for medical devices, a step up in terms of thinking about a risk-based classificatory system. So when we think about risk-based, that means there will be considerations of in terms of the risk factor, right? The severity of an adverse outcome and the likelihood or the probability of the outcome arising. So what's interesting is that if we were to have a step up from the conventional principles that apply to the regulation of medical devices, right? There's been traditionally stronger emphasis on severity rather than the probability dimension. And then when we think about how to assess the risk and basically how to draw out the risk factors, right? There are considerations of intentionality as opposed to functionality. Some scholars argue that, there's no substantial difference between the two, but then there may be some important regulatory differences. I highlight these two because I haven't got time to go into it, but they do point to some of the differences in approach taken up by the FDA on the one hand, that's in the US jurisdiction, and then of course the EMA on the other hand, the European Medicines Agency, which is responsible for regulating medical devices in the European Union. So some differences there. My own sense is that on the mainland, it's likely to be closer to the US approach. But which is quite interesting because if you look at the data governance that's emerging on mainland China, it's a lot closer to the European Union, mainly because some of the primary jurisdiction, the personal information protection law in particular, is modeled after the European Union, if I may say so, given the similarity of the provisions. So quite apart from the risk-based classificatory system, would also have considerations of safety as opposed to cost. So if we think about regulatory mechanisms, including the role of regulators, you see that there would be this sort of balancing or trade-offs even that would be factored in. But by and large, if we look at the regulatory structure and regulatory mindset, you'd find that the requirements are in proportion to the risk. So for instance, if you are talking about essentially low-risk medical device like a Band-Aid, yes, that is medical device as well. Some of you may find it surprising, but for low-risk device such as that, the requirement is just essentially in many jurisdictions a declaration by the manufacturer of safety and what it's intended to do. So not especially onerous. But then, of course, when you talk about in vitro devices, if you talk about a pacemaker, for example, then, of course, understandably, the requirements would be a lot more. So in terms of marketing approval, and then also post-marketing requirements. So, so just to highlight very broadly what the regulatory principles are, I haven't got time to go into that, but it's important to have this background information because, as I've indicated earlier, when we think about AI, whether machine learning or perhaps even more with deep learning capability, right? It's essentially a step up from those principles. Whether rightly or not, I think that's something that we could talk about further. So where are we headed with all of these technological development and data resource? So as I've indicated, we want to develop learning tool and or tool applications. So the capability of health systems to draw on all of these resources in order to, for example, provide safer care and provide more effective care and even ultimately more personalized care. So you see that from a systematic review that's being done on the topic, these 9 categories of learning tool applications have been consolidated into 4 main clinical applications. So you see all of them having research-related considerations. When we think about standards setting, of course, this is not your conventional clinical trial kind of, or it could be actually drawing on clinical trial data, but you'd have essentially standard settings, decision-making, intelligent automation, and risk modeling. So the goal is essentially, as you see, directed broadly at developing smarter healthcare systems to optimize treatment decisions, ultimately, perhaps through the use of relatively autonomous AI or machine learning-based devices, drawing on a range of data resources, including electronic health records, as well as some of the other social, data, including perhaps those from social media. So I was going to say, so that broadly is when we talk about learning health system, where all of these developments are being directed at. So in the paper that I co-wrote with a colleague in Singapore, so you'd see that currently what we have, well, actually interestingly is in the UK, what we have in place, drawing on these kind of data resource is an initiative like the Think Kidney initiative under the NHS. So, so NHS working with DeepMind, of course, being part of Google, as you know, has developed a notification system. So based on monitoring of patients with kidney injury, the creatinine level in particular, they'll be able to pick up in advance, so typically a few hours in advance of kidney failure. And at that point where the problem is being picked up on, the system itself will immediately send out alerts to healthcare providers. So that means you have to intervene now in order to save the kidney. Otherwise, of course, you're at serious risk of losing the kidney in the patient concern. So this system already has been projected to save the NHS an average of £2,000 per patient. So that's quite a bit. Now, if we are to draw on AI technology and if we are to build up that deep learning system, right, then one of the potential is this. So there's currently a proof of concept in the US, and some of you may be familiar with this. So DeepMind has drawn on data from hospitals run by the Department of Veteran Affairs. So using that data, they have developed a system that could predict kidney failure, not just a few hours ahead of the incident. It's potentially 1 to 2 days in advance. So think about the lead time that clinicians would have in responding to a medical crisis. Of course, this is just still very much in the experimental stage. There are some very serious limitations, as you see, one of which, of course, would be that given that these are facilities run by the Veteran Affairs Department, they are mainly from male patients. So there is, at least looking at the published paper, very little data on female patients. So it's not likely to work, this particular device, in an unbiased way if applied to, say, for example, a female patient with rather different sorts of physiological profiles or medical characteristics. So some important limitations to address, but the proof of concept is there. So I hope helpful in terms of illustrating some of the benefits, and of course, needless to say, the cost savings dimension is expected to be expanded much further. So how do we get to this, learning healthcare space? Of course, for this part of the world, there would also be the convergence issue, but relevant to both topics of convergence and integration, right, would be to think about regulatory governance. How do we ensure that that developers and other interested stakeholders could collaborate in a way that is effective, and of course also meeting the sort of standards that need to be in place. Of course, these would be safety standards, ethical standards, because we are working with human participants, and of course efficacy that one should be concerned with as well. So when we think about the regulatory governance mindset, it's important to consider what values to apply. You'd think that such values may, I would argue, be quite different from how we would apply in regulating conventional research, certainly within an IRB or REC kind of setting, right? So my argument, just to put it up front, and I'll get to that again, would be to move away from the risk management mindset. So currently, if you apply a risk management kind of mindset to, say, the regulation of clinical trials, there is very good reason to do that. But my argument is that if you just do that for AI, development of AI and AI or machine learning based devices, it's not going to work. So in thinking about the approach as well, do we adopt a threshold kind of approach, which seems to be the sort of approach that's taken in a more conventional research ethics kind of context? Or can we think more about trade-offs? And if we are to think about trade-offs, then what are the perimeters? So these are some very important questions that we can't really resolve today, but then I thought I'll highlight that as one of the potentially pertinent issues. So we are talking about a very complex regulatory landscape. So there would be regulations that apply specifically to software. Some jurisdictions in the EU especially, they are talking about targeted regulation of these devices. Just about in all of the key jurisdictions, you've got rather sophisticated regulations on use of data. Of course, not just regulation, of course, you'd have ethical provisions as well, or ethical frameworks for that matter. Now, it can be rather complex for a jurisdiction like China, because when we think about data governance, there is not one legislation, but potentially three. So depending on the nature of the work. So some of you who are familiar with mainland China, you know that just introduced last year, there's the Personal Information Protection Law, which is, as I've indicated, quite similar to the GDPR in the European Union, which is quite interesting because the privacy regime that we have in Hong Kong, the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance, it's based on a earlier version of the GDPR. So that would be the Data Protection Directive. So rather more similar to the UK Data Protection Act. I'll speak more about that. But again, going back to the topic on China, right? So you'd have that personal data protection regime recently introduced. And then, of course, in addition to this, there would be the cybersecurity law, of course, cybersecurity being a very important concern, generally security concerns, and then data security as well. So aside from data governance, we also have to think about professional governance. So there are very specific rules, as many of you who either are in healthcare or work with healthcare providers will know that there are very strict ethical codes on the use of patient information. There are also very important laws that apply to that. In Hong Kong, there are specific laws on access and use of electronic health records and data from there, and that is similarly the case in many of the other jurisdictions. So we need to think about that at that level as well, the professional level, and some of the other civic groups that may be involved in data generation and care provision of some sorts. That may be outside of the strict or formal healthcare facility kind of setting. So in drawing all of these things together, of course, we do need to think about how to have in place an effective monitoring and evaluation system that could operate at scale. So you'd see one of the key features would be the adaptive element of medical device, which would make the entire process or the entire thinking about all of these concerns somewhat more complicated. So the World Health Organization has put forward a number of consensus principles. So we're now moving into the value space, right, in thinking about sort of regulations. And these are broader regulations that would apply to the development and implementation of AI-based medical devices. And they're quite separate, as you'd see, but of course connected to the regulatory principles that we have considered earlier on. So the regulatory principles tend to be somewhat more processual. So they are directed at ensuring that some baseline perimeter is being observed. But beyond that, of course, you'd have these values that come into effect and very important in thinking about development and operation. So a paper that was published in 2020 in the American Journal of Bioethics has very helpfully mapped out in terms of the developmental pipeline, right, what some of the ethical issues could be at each stage of the process. So you're welcome to have a look at that. So it's interesting to think about how these sorts of considerations map onto the broader kinds of considerations that the WHO has set out. Of course, WHO essentially has in mind its audience as its member states, so essentially governments. Whereas this particular paper would speak to, well, developers, professionals, an audience that's wider than what WHO would have in mind. But why I set out these two slides would be because it's intended to show the different sorts of values that could come into play. But there is less clarity in terms of how they should all come together and by what means, you see, and how they could cohere in a particular decision. So that's something that we'll need to consider carefully moving forward. A bit more about the Hong Kong situation. I've mentioned that there are specific provisions on the use of electronic health record system. So this is an example of it. So the Data Protection Commissioner in Hong Kong has been very proactive, and I think in a very good way. So she has drawn on some of the key data protection principles in our existing ordinance, and to see how it could be moved forward in thinking about important issues like data stewardship and broader ethical principles that will relate to AI development. So this would be moving beyond what would be the strict perimeters of the data protection legislation, but drawing on a number of important norms that we see in the international value domains, values domain. So, so for those interested, you're welcome to have a look at this document. But a number of recommendations would be consistent with what we see in regulatory principles put forward by the IMDRF that we mentioned earlier. So that speaks to the human in the loop feature, but it's interesting to think harder about what human in the loop would mean in particular, and what that sort of loop would be like. Again, we haven't got time to go into that, but I do think that this is quite an important topic for those involved in research ethics, if you are to think about a more integrated space in moving this particular technology forward. And of course, what's important to note, of course, is that in terms of the development of an AI system, it's a lot more engaging. It involves a lot more stakeholders, and it's a lot more responsive. So the device itself is not static. So it could potentially change. And if we think about deep learning, right, then what you have put out in the market initially may have a completely different risk profile once it's introduced into a particular operational space. So that's one of the key challenges. How do we regulate such a device, which of course, when we think about this feature as compared to say a pharmaceutical product, very, very different, isn't it? Because if you talk about the introduction of a pharmaceutical product within the human body, then relatively stable kind of environment, and we can therefore speak sensibly about the risk profile. It's somewhat harder when we think about an AI device. So that's again to contrast the two, right? There are already some very important differences if we think about a regular medical device. So this is not an AI-based device. And if we were to compare the trial regime, so these are the device trials with a clinical drug trial, some similarities, but also some very important differences. But as I've noted earlier on, some of the very important differences that we see in device, right, development and related trials would be a much stronger reliance in terms of looking into existing risk profiles of comparable devices, if any, and of course also heavy reliance on post-access kind of monitoring and evaluation, as well as the collection and use of real-world data, which is interesting because it then circles back to thinking about the sort of data protection requirements and processes that need to be in place. And of course, this would be right through from the R&D phase to the clinical application phase. So, so some important points to note. For those who are interested in this discussion, you may want to have a look at the reference, which could speak to some of these particular issues. But what I wanted to highlight in this rather short paper that you see here, that's written, in fact, in response to the 2020 paper. Michael Abramov was one of the authors. You see, he was actually one of the key developers of IDXDR, as I've mentioned earlier on. But I wanted to highlight a number of ISO principles that would apply. So you'd see that quite aside from our regulatory principles, our broad governance principles that we've considered from WHO, related regulatory principles on the data front, there would also be principles that would apply to manufacturers. So these are set out very clearly in a number of ISO documents. But if we put all of these together, you'd see that there are some very important changes in the regulatory paradigm from what would be conventional to what we find in the digital health domain. So I've set out a number of them here. You're welcome to consider that, but I just want to note in particular the adaptive feature that I've mentioned at the start. Happy to elaborate more about that during Q&A if we have time. Sorry, I'm just having a time check. Okay, I should press on. So a final segment of my presentation. So who's responsible? Who ought to be responsible? What sort of responsibility are we talking about? Well, I've wrote a bit about that in relation to developments in Canada. I'm happy to say that there are similar developments here in Hong Kong. So the Hong Kong Academy of Medicine, which is responsible for all specialty training or training of specialists in Hong Kong, is now developing a guidance document to help think about a number of these developments. So I've also noted the UK Academy of Royal Medical Colleges. So they also have in place a guidance document. So I think it's important to start the affected professions, first of all, radiologists, for example, in thinking about how to work with developers of this technology, essentially by fleshing out the sort of values that will be important at the profession end, and also how it's going to link up with those of other stakeholders. And that is what we see developing in a number of these documents. So it's somewhat more, so to speak, bottom up, you see. So where you'd have the users coming together, there is a great need to try to draw in more on patient values. So in more recent documents by WHO, it has highlighted that. But patient values do not just come in on their own, as many of you would know and agree, right? So there must be facilitative systems in place. There must be a safe environment. There must be active facilitation of these values, what's ultimately important to patients. And of course, all of these various data could have huge HTA or cost-related kind of implications that will also need to be supported. But let me just end off. It's a quick overview, and I apologize for that. There's really quite a bit, but I thought from this presentation, I'd just like to highlight some very important changes in the nature and character of governance. And certainly for the purposes of the wonderful course that's been headed up by and Johns Hopkins, to think about how in training up the next generation of research ethics administrators, scholars, perhaps policymakers, the sort of processual change that will need to be made in order to support AI development. As I've mentioned at the start of the presentation and also highlighted throughout the presentation, when we think about especially the sort of deep learning technology that we want to have in place, right, you will need a very sophisticated data infrastructure, and you also need to have a very sophisticated regulatory infrastructure in order to work with this particular device because its risk profile is likely to change once it is introduced in an environment. So working up a more conventional regulatory approach that's based on a fixed risk profile, I think is not going to be particularly helpful. And it does raise some very important questions that are linked to some of the other issues that we already know and associated with AI technology, the black box issue, concerns about explainability and accountability. So all of this, I think, would be related considerations under the broad governance umbrella. So let me just conclude by saying that in charting some of the developments in this part of the world, we are actively thinking about the sort of mechanisms and entities that will need to come together in order to steer the development forward and to have responsible as well as responsive supervision, because ultimately we want to ensure that patients get access to the best, most effective and safe device that will be appropriate for their condition. So these are a number of driving factors, but then of course the underlying perimeters will need to be clear. We are trying to build up a facilitative system, one with responsible intermediaries and of course one that's integrated. So that of course will be involving a lot of stakeholders, including users. And finally, to introduce a sort of stewardship model. So this is still very much in the works because, as I've mentioned, for the Greater Bay Area, there are 3 different jurisdictions concerned. And the notion of fiduciary is quite different, and there would be some epistemological kind of differences that will need to be ironed out. So with this as a broad overview, sorry to run over time, I do think we may have a bit of time for Q&A, so select references for those who are interested. Thank you so much again for your attention, and please do get in touch. So it's over to Joe. Apologies, Joe, for running over time.
No, not at all, Kevin. We're delighted, and it's our apologies for starting the presentation a little bit late today. I believe we have just a few minutes. Maybe we can take a couple of questions. And I see there's one in the chat here. We can take that one perhaps.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah.
So asking about your thoughts on balancing advances in AI and ensuring that the delivery of healthcare doesn't lose the human touch. So yeah, the implications of all of this for personalization of care and the like. Any thoughts you might have there?
Yeah, thank you so much for the great question. So I guess many of us would already be familiar with Eric Topol's famous position. So his argument is that in supporting AI development, it would allow clinicians more time to engage with patients and therefore become better clinicians or more patient-centered clinicians. So that would be, I would argue, a more consequentialist kind of approach, but quite apart from that, still important nonetheless. So but to get there, we need to ensure that there are appropriate systems in place. So these are workflow arrangements to ensure that clinicians who do actually have more time do not end off doing some other things which may be important. So they might be driven to meet other tasks. But quite aside from that, I think it's also very important to think about the sort of values that we need to have reflected in the AI device itself. So if we are, so thinking ahead, right, if we are to have relatively autonomous deep learning kind of device in the system, their operation, the sort of decisions that they would recommend or the sort of actions that would take should reflect the sort of values that we hold to be important. So just like any other healthcare providers, of course, the application of these devices are likely to be a lot more focused, a lot more targeted, and I think rightly so. But even for these very specific tasks, it must be consistent with the sort of values that we would find acceptable. So, well, hopefully a general and somewhat tentative response, but do feel free to get in touch if you'd like to discuss this some more. Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah, thank you. Adiba, over to you.
Yeah, Calvin, great presentation. Thank you very much. I'm asking you a question from the angle of an educator rather than a clinician. You know, this is, as you started off, it's a very complex new area. And if we're expecting regulators to regulate the field, what steps are being taken to educate them so that they understand what it is that they're regulating? And I guess this question doesn't pertain to regulators. I mean, it's a whole new field, right? So yeah, what steps are we taking in Hong Kong and other places that you know of to even give them the basics of what it is that they're regulating?
Thank you so much for the great question, Prof. Adiba. So very important to engage with all stakeholders at every level. So starting with, say, for example, or specifically talking about policymakers, right? There's been a number of important initiatives. When we think about the World Health Organization, its report on ethics in and healthcare, right? That is essentially meant as an instructional tool. So some very important questions raised and to be considered by policymakers would be one such as whether you even need the AI technology at this point. So are you just interested because of the sort of image that it might give to your system, but without actually generating any real value for your system that's concerned? So I think these are some very pointed questions that are meant for policymakers to think about. So that's one example at the international level. I think following the World Health Assembly resolution that was in 2018 on digital health, there's been a number of initiatives taken up to engage further with health departments, health ministers around the world. So that's a further initiative, but I think that got a bit waylaid because of COVID. So everybody got caught up with COVID following that. But I suspect that as COVID passes, we'll see a number of these initiatives taken up again. In Hong Kong, I've referred to the document by the Privacy Commissioner. She has intended that essentially as an instructional document as well. So that would be useful. So I think on that point, I should highlight that one of the key difference, I'm not sure about Malaysia, so I'll be keen to hear about the situation in Malaysia. So the personal data protection regime in Singapore, for example, it's only applicable to private entities, not to the public sector. That's not the case in Hong Kong. So for Hong Kong, it's responsible for both the private and the public sectors. And hence, the document that we see will have, or is expected to have instructional value right through these two sectors. So these are just a number of initiatives, but I'm with you, Professor Diba, in terms of the great need to help people understand more about where we're going with this, especially also in given the assurance that they're, for the common person, that their jobs may not be taken away, that they will not be substituted, but some jobs will be at risk. We have to be honest about that. So, so therefore, we also do need to think quite carefully about retraining if we are intending to introduce these sort of technologies. But thank you again for that great question and remark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Calvin. I see we're just about 5 minutes over time. I don't know if you have another engagement to get to, but we have one more question in the chat. I have 10 different questions for you, which I won't raise now. We can talk later.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Joe. Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe if you have just another amendment, I just want to take this question in the chat.
Okay. Yeah.
So it has to do with the human in the loop piece. And the question is really, if there's any guidance on the extent to which having a human oversight is needed. I think I've heard some colleagues who work in technology spaces saying sometimes from their perspective, they'd rather get the humans out of the loop, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Sorry, Azana. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really helpful to highlight that very important point, and thanks so much for the elaboration, Joe. So it is a difficult question, because when we think about human in the loop, it's not just about human oversight. So my concern about human oversight, right, and as you've heard from Joe, right, having human in the loop in a sort of risk management kind of way, as you also imagine in a regular science kind of way, might translate to more bureaucracy, more restrictions. So that's not particularly helpful in terms of thinking about how to move ahead with the development you see. And that's also a challenge for IRBs or RECs, because as many of you may know, IRBs responsibility, of course, first and foremost would be to protect the interest of participants, the interest and well-being, but it also has the responsibility of facilitating the development of good science, of course, in a responsible manner. So we need to draw on this broad notion and to see how we ought to introduce the human in the loop that is, on the one hand, providing the assurance that that key ethical provisions and concerns are being observed, but on the other, also moving forward with the development. So it does speak to quite an important shift in mindset and how we ought to, for those who are legally trained, right, how we need to translate in a processual sort of way. So it can't be a strict standard process, a rigid kind of approach that we could simply adopt. So it can't be an algorithm. It's ironic, isn't it, using that term? But then it really has to be a lot more responsive. So that's what I have to say for now. But if you're interested on that topic, please feel free to get in touch, and perhaps Joe might want to consider somewhat more targeted discussion of this in relation to particular use cases, because then that I think will be more instructive. But sorry about the somewhat more general talk today. Hopefully helpful still.
No, very, very, very helpful and so rich
so much,
and informative. So thank you for that, Calvin. And I know the Global Forum on Bioethics and Research this year will be taking place in November or December, I believe, in South Africa, focusing on ethics and AI and governance in research. So more thinking and work, I think, is going to happen, more use cases to share globally.
Absolutely. And I think Joe is on the committee. So well, he's the go-to person.
I don't know, Calvin. Well, great. Well, maybe we should wrap it up there then, respect everyone's time. And thank you again for joining and sharing today's talk. Adiba, any last comments or thoughts from you?
No, I've really enjoyed it very much, as I think with many of those who joined us this morning. Thank you so much, Kelvin. You've made a tough area of discussion sound easy. Well, not quite easy, but much more digestible. Yeah, so we look
Thank you
forward
so
to
much,
welcoming
Professor.
you. We look forward to welcoming you to Kuala Lumpur and meeting in person. And thank you everyone for joining, and please look out for our next episode of Hot Topics in Research Ethics soon. So have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Pleasant weekend ahead, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. We look